The icy wind pierced through James Wilson's winter jacket as he trudged through the thick snowdrifts, clogging the rocky mountain pass. With a sudden blizzard severing all visibility, his only guide was the GPS tracker clutched tightly in his gloved hands. According to the blinking screen, he had drifted at least 2 miles off the marked trail during his desperate attempt to outpace the storm. James paused, panting heavily in the thin air as he swiveled the device, hoping to glimpse any sign of a route or potential shelter. Nothing but a sea of white greeted his frenzied stare. A fresh blast of powdery flakes assaulted his goggles, further obscuring his reading of the display. As it was wont to do in these parts, the weather had changed without warning, transforming a beautiful winter hike into a struggle for survival within mere hours. His fingers trembled violently, whether from exhaustion or the deepening chill. James couldn't be sure. He knew he couldn't last long exposed on the open slope, with temperatures plummeting by the minute. Fueled partially by panic, he redoubled his efforts to scout for cover through the blizzard. Just when hope seemed lost, a faint shadow materialized through the veil of snowfall ahead. James stumbled forward hastily and collided with a solid rock wall partially obscured beneath snowdrifts. He coughed violently from his near collapse, desperately fighting to regain control of his freezing lungs. Once his spasms subsided, trembling hands shoved aside plumes of powder to reveal an opening into the cliff face. A dark passage beckoned, promising warmth and shelter within. Scrambling on numb limbs, James half crawled his way inside the narrow cave. Relative protection from the screaming wind greeted him, yet the numbing cold permeated deep into the stone walls. He dragged himself deep within, collapsing in a heaving pile of sweat, soaked layers and torn outerwear over a century of untouched frost. Every inhale seared his raw throat and lungs like swallowing needles of ice. As his quaking muscles began to unwind from their clenched state, James realized with dawning horror how badly off he was. His backpack, supplies, and precious extra clothing layers had all been lost in his mad dash to escape the whiteout. All he had left was a half-full water bottle, protein bar, knife, headlamp, and the clothes freezing stiff to his shivering form. With no way to communicate his position or guide an expected rescue party through the featureless tundra, James feared this forgotten cavern may well become his final resting place. James jolted back to consciousness with a start, his parched throat emitting an involuntary croak at the unfamiliar surroundings enclosing him. Disoriented, it took several moments of peering through the dim cave until shards of memory began piercing through his clouded mind. The brutal storm, seeking shelter, his missing gear. Panic seized James' heaving chest as full realization dawned. He was trapped, alone and cut off from the outside world, with barely any supplies. Fumbling through numb limbs, he dragged out his headlamp and water bottle, taking a shallow sip to ease his scorched insides. The last rays of light had long since faded, leaving him no clue how many days had elapsed already. Time ceased to hold meaning, as James settled into a precarious routine of rationing his meager remaining resources. His damaged internal mantle clock told of at least 2 weeks passing in crushing isolation and deprivation as the relentless blizzard continued unabated outside. Each waking was a torment, as his starved body clamored weakly for sustenance, while his parched throat provided no relief. Hallucinations began creeping through the disorienting cycles of consciousness, conjuring specters from happier times to haunt his maddened mind. Visions of thickly wooded trails morphed into gusting snowdrifts. The echoes of distant laughter distorted into bone-chilling shrieks carried by the howling gales. Only through clinging desperately to faded memories of family was James able to retain a tenuous grip on his slipping sanity. As his strength ebbed with each laborious breath, talk of rescue shifted to far-fetched notions of tunneling through solid rock with nothing but bare hands. James knew this desperate quest was futile, yet the feral survival instinct demanded action over hopeless acceptance. Gouging bloody trenches into calloused palms provided a momentary escape from dwelling on his inevitable fate. The familiar ache of hunger had long shifted to a gnawing void, dominating James' every fleeting thought. His protruding ribs rose and fell with increasing strain beneath translucent skin as starvation began shutting down non-essential functions. Lying motionless in his weakened delirium, it occurred to James with horrifying clarity. What actions may soon become necessary for even the slimmest chance of prolonging life? Yet some small flicker of humanity remained clinging to the precipice of primal instinct, resisting the unthinkable for now. Instead, James' mind drifted to simpler days spent surrounded by loved ones, barbecues in the summer sunshine, Christmas by the fireplace, family camping trips. If death was to claim him, perhaps these tender memories could provide solace in his final moments of fading consciousness within the icy tomb. 2 weeks had passed since Sarah Wilson last heard from her husband, James, during his planned solo hiking trip through the Rocky Mountains. Attempts to reach him by phone went straight to voicemail, as the remote trails lacked cell reception. At first, she tried not to worry. It wasn't unusual for hikers to spend extra time exploring the natural beauty. But as the days stretched on without contact, unease settled like frost in Sarah's stomach. When a full week went by, she filed a missing persons report with the local authorities. Chief Ranger Paul Johnson took on the case personally, recognizing the need for urgency as winter weather set in earlier than usual that season. Paul was no stranger to the dangers those unforgiving peaks could pose. Having overseen numerous search and rescue operations over his 20-year career, something didn't sit right about James simply vanishing without a trace. Mobilizing a team of experienced rangers and volunteers, Paul got to work meticulously, combing over James' intended route and surrounding areas section by section. By section, helicopters were scrambled to scan from above, while crews on skis and snowmobiles canvassed below, calling out his name until their voices turned hoarse. But without clues as to how far he may have strayed, the search radius kept expanding like ripples in a frozen lake. Sarah launched her own efforts, driving endlessly and posting flyers across surrounding towns. Her desperate pleas for information were met mostly with sympathy rather than leads. As more time drifted by without answers, she grew disturbingly thinner and pale, consumed from the inside by anguish. Paul saw in her hollow stare a grim reflection of countless others awaiting closure they may never find. Back at Ranger headquarters, the task force pored over maps and supply lists, hypothesizing each new angle that could break open the case. Unsure whether James had sustained an accident, gone astray in the backcountry, or met with foul play, they strategized accordingly. Special K-9 units scoured for any human scent, while volunteers and local tribes combed remote trails for any overlooked clue amongst the thickening snowdrifts. On the 30th day since James' scheduled return, Paul received the call he dreaded. Sarah had been found barely conscious at the base of a rocky crag, having seemingly suffered a breakdown. Her condition only further fueled his drive to solve the desperate search. Yet each returning group brought only disappointing shakes of their heads. What had initially seemed a straightforward rescue operation transformed into an arduous hunt for a needle in an avalanche of white. Time had ceased to hold meaning for James as he drifted between the realm of consciousness and the brink of oblivion within the icy cave. How many days, or was it weeks, had it been since he last felt even the phantom motions of life, stirring within his starved shell of a body? Some primal instinct kept drawing James back from the beckoning blackness each time, if only to experience yet another waking filled with agony. Weakened to little more than translucent skin pulled tautly over jutting bone, James knew this feeble existence could not last much longer. With his parched throat reduced to a bleeding mass of raw tissue, even drawing shallow breaths had become excruciating torment. The frantic noises emanating from deep within his twisting guts chilled James to his core. His organs were beginning to consume themselves in a last-ditch effort to sustain any lingering signs of life. There could be no denying what action was required for sustaining consciousness, however briefly. Any longer, James crawled weakly over numb limbs, gone stiff from the chilling floor. It took tremendous effort just to retrieve the knife, clenched tightly in his fist, the last remaining tool for shaping his grim fate. With shaking hands, he made the first incision, both dreading and welcoming impending relief from the anguished hunger. Frantically sawing through flesh and tendon, James was soon holding the severed appendage, faced with the full reality of his actions. Revulsion and relief warred within as crazed instincts demanded consumption to prolong his crumbling existence, even if only by moments. Gagging down the first morsels was the most agonizing experience of his ravaged life. Yet the primitive signals of nourishment gradually muting his starvation provided a distorted solace. As James collapsed in a heaving heap, his fading mind drifted through memories and fantasies of loved ones. Perhaps they would find him like this, barely clinging to life, and get him to help in time. Or maybe the cave would serve as his burial crypt, leaving only bones for discovery someday in the distant future. Either outcome was preferable to fully succumbing to his feral state, reduced to little more than a rabid beast, surviving on its own mutilated flesh. James knew he was irrevocably changed regardless of his fate, stripped of dignity and humanity. All that remained was to fade into the abyss, desperately praying for an end or rescue before madness consumed him entirely. Just then, a faint, whirring sound echoed from beyond, stirring the last vestiges of hope from the ashes of his ruined soul. The rescue helicopter touched down in a flurry of snow kicked up by powerful rotor blades. Ranger Paul leapt out, followed by an emergency response team, armed with a stretcher and medical supplies. Led by the frantic buzzing of his radio tracker, they rushed towards the narrow cave entrance and spilled inside. Gasps of horror echoed off frigid walls at the ravaged form of James Wilson, slumped motionless on the floor. One leg was missing below the knee, bloody bone and tissue exposed where flesh had clearly been hacked away. Medics shoved past their shock to begin essential triage, confirming a faint pulse beneath ashen skin, barely clinging to bone. It was a nightmare scene that would haunt Paul for years to come, a testament to the darkness that starvation and isolation can drive a man towards. Yet nestled within the grisly remains was an indomitable will to live against all odds. James was stretchered gingerly back to the chopper and rushed to the nearest trauma center, hanging onto life by a fraying thread. The intensive care unit became James' new and likely final domain, as doctors raced to repair his extensive trauma and begin refeeding. Through it all, he remained tethered to machines, though consciousness never fully returned. Meanwhile, Paul broke the terrible news to Sarah. whose anguished cries reverberated through him like an aching wound. Finally, after weeks hovering at death's threshold, James began a sluggish climb back towards health. As awareness resurfaced, memories of his ordeal spilled out in garbled screams and tears that left nurses pale. A psychologist was called in to assess his state of mind. Had the trauma induced lasting psychosis, or was he culpable for his horrific act of survival? Dr. Emma Blake spent hours at James' bedside, gently questioning to piece together just what drove a man to such extremes of depravity. Once stable enough for visitors, Sarah sat by her husband's bed, clutching his skeletal hand, as if to will life back into his wasted form. Their tearful reunion conveyed what no words could: a shared trauma that would bond them always, yet leave scars running deeper than flesh. Only time would tell if their marriage could weather what James had endured and done to return. Regardless of the legal outcome, Chief Ranger Paul believed the man lying broken before him now was driven to the edge of sanity by forces utterly out of his control. Perhaps, with support, James may one day find a way to live with what the mountains had transformed him into in order to survive their wrath. 2 long years drifted by as James Wilson slowly rebuilt his shattered life, both physically and mentally. Under the careful guidance of Dr. Emma Blake, weekly therapy sessions helped process the trauma that would forever imprint his soul. Night terrors still plagued his nights, awakening in cold sweats from visceral memories of starvation and madness within the icy tomb. Those dark days when he was reduced to little more than a feral beast stalked James in his darkest moments of doubt. Yet through it all, an unwavering source of light remained. Sarah's faith in the man she loved never wavered, anchoring James to his humanity. Her steadfast support allowed fragile seeds of healing to take tentative root. Though prosecutors initially deemed his actions punishable under law, public outcry swayed opinion. Most recognized James as the victim of circumstances totally beyond control, driven to unthinkable extremes by primal instinct alone. After a lengthy psychiatric evaluation, all charges were dropped on grounds of temporary insanity, brought on by extreme duress. A guilty verdict could have destroyed what little progress remained. Slowly, with encouragement, James began to venture out on gentle nature trails once more. Hand in hand with his wife, the calming woods allowed soothing echoes of happier times to drown out demons. His gaping scar served as a reminder of the fragility of life in those unforgiving peaks, and the perseverance of the indestructible human spirit against even its darkest depths. Ranger Paul kept close tabs as James healed, both physically and emotionally. An unbreakable bond formed between rescuer and survivor that day in the frozen cave, tied by what they endured together. 5 years later, when Paul retired after decades of service, James was the first to congratulate his friend for leaving on a high note after saving lives without end. In quiet moments, James often pondered the man he was before that fateful storm changed his destiny forever. Though much had shattered beyond repair, valuable new lessons were gained through agony. Most impactful was appreciation for the simple gift of another sunrise, and determination to make the most of each sunrise's opportunity, however many remain. With time's gentle hand upon his weary soul, James found peace through forging a new purpose. He began volunteering for backcountry rescue crews, lending empathy and guidance, reminder to never underestimate mankind's innate strength of spirit to overcome even history's darkest hours. Though scars would always linger, in the clearing waited brighter days ahead.